benedicta
Hello, and welcome to Historia Ecclesiastica. My name is Daniel Sudi. This video is the second part to a two-part video on how the West became secular. Please look below for the link to the first part in order to learn more about Christian civilization before the Enlightenment, to learn about the sanctified and holy institutions of the West before they became darkened by the so-called Enlightenment. All right, let's get started with part 2 of how the West became secular. So any discussion of the Enlightenment needs to begin with René Descartes. So René Descartes was born in Sweden in 1596, and he died in 1650. And he was a Roman Catholic, and he saw himself as a Catholic throughout his life. He never saw his philosophy as taking himself outside of the bounds of the Catholic Church. What was the purpose of his philosophical endeavors? He attempted to establish an irrefutable bedrock of philosophy. He wanted to find the first premise upon which all other premises could be based upon, or he wanted to find a system in which we could absolutely verify that a philosophical idea, an abstract concept, was absolutely true. So he wanted to find something that could be the absolute bedrock, that we could have total confidence in. He's famous for irrefutably proving his own existence by the statement, "I think, therefore I am." And what that means is he believed that we can understand the world only through ideas. So you see your garden outside. Well, what you think is just your plain observation is really what your sensory organs are telling your mind, and then your mind is coming up with ideas about the garden. And so his proof for his own existence is that he is thinking. And because he is thinking, because he's generating these ideas, he knows at least he exists. And that would be the bedrock of his philosophy. But Descartes causes a very profound movement on philosophy in the West. He creates this desire amongst philosophers to not assert an idea unless they can be absolutely confident in that idea. And he's creating a sort of cyclone of doubt in the West, where philosophers and scientists won't believe something unless they can be absolutely true, unless they can be absolutely certain that what they're believing is true. There is this new desire for verification of everything through proof. And philosophers are hesitant to give their assent or their faith to anything without absolute empirical verification. Imagine a kid who asks you a question, like, why is the sky blue? And you tell them the standard answer, if you know how to tell the standard answer without fumbling over your words like I probably would, about the wavelengths of the color blue or something. And then after you answer it, the kid asks, well, how do you know that's for sure true? And then you answer that, if you can. And then they say, well, how do you know that's for sure true? How do you know that's for sure true? Ultimately, for almost any question, you're going to get to a point where you say, you know what, I'm not absolutely sure I know that's true. However, we believe that it's okay to give your assent to something being true without having absolute verification for it. Of course, at some point, we have to have faith in God without absolute, beyond any shadow of a doubt, verification of his existence. We believe there's a place for faith in our intellectual lives. But in every area of our lives, there's a place for faith. How do you know the chair you're sitting on was properly constructed? Were you in the factory watching it be made? How do you know the architect who built your home didn't make it with a 70-year lifespan, and once we reach that point, your roof is going to collapse on you? We live our whole lives giving our assent of faith to things that we haven't absolutely verified. And that's just simply the way it has to be, because our minds were not created to be all-knowing or have the ability to absolutely verify everything. So ultimately, Descartes sends Western philosophy and Western thought down this cyclone of doubt upon doubt upon doubt upon doubt. And we're going to see about 100 years after him, we have philosophers rampantly having doubt in the truths of divine revelation that have been the absolute treasure of the West ever since the gospel was first preached to the West in the first century. In the 19th century, Cardinal Henry Newman published his Assent of Faith, and I recommend checking it out if you find this topic interesting, in which he attempted to save Western philosophy by arguing that it is okay to give your assent to faith without having absolute verification for it. Now, some would say the Enlightenment has origins dating back farther than René Descartes. It's quite reasonable to say that the Renaissance humanist movement, which began in the 13th century and extended all the way through the 15th century, could have laid the groundwork for the Enlightenment, because the Renaissance humanist movement attempted to answer questions using independent studies and using classical philosophical tools, besides just kind of the accepted common answers that were being passed down. So, for example, if there was a question about, let's say, disease, what's the best way to cure a disease? Renaissance humanists would try to look for new answers to those questions than simply the conventional wisdom that was being passed down. So there was already within Western civilization around the 13th century this heritage of doubt, scholarly doubt, and in a lot of ways that's good. Challenging assumptions and really trying to get to the bottom of the truth of big questions about the universe and about the world. However, there has to be a balance between that healthy scholarly doubt and just obedience to what we should not doubt, like the revelation that Jesus Christ passed down to the apostles, to be passed down to the bishops through all generations. We're supposed to safeguard that tradition. So that heritage of scholarly doubt ended up infecting theology in the 16th century, and we call that the Protestant Reformation. Scholars such as Martin Luther and Zwingli and John Calvin all applied the same sort of philosophical or dialectical tools of the Renaissance humanist movement to answer questions about how is it that we are saved, or in what should we look to for the source of divine revelation. They answered those theological questions in manners that were expressing profound doubt on the received tradition of the church, which was bad. So that's the part where scholarly doubt has no place, is in the received dogmas of the church. Though scholarly doubt could, it has a role in scholarship in the church in discussing theological questions, but it needs to be done with humility. And Martin Luther and the other heresiarchs of the Protestant Reformation, it did not approach those questions with humility. So, in a sense, humanism begets Protestantism, and Protestantism would beget doubt in theology itself, which would continue to foment into the Enlightenment. You can actually see throughout the 17th century the religious movements such as the Quakers and the Shakers, and then you can see political movements such as the Diggers that are continuing to express profound doubt in religion in general, not just in the established church. The Quakers and the Shakers expressed doubt in some of the core dogmas of Christianity, like the Trinity, for example. They formed more of a similar to like New Agey movements today. Quakers believed that all people had direct access to the, quote, spiritual light. They were opposed to any sort of a spiritual hierarchy. They didn't really have a very strong sense in doctrine at all. They wanted to kind of be spiritually happy, but outside of the confines of an organized religion. The Shakers were very similar to the Quakers. They were perhaps more socially radical. They created communities with gender and social class equality. They also believed that their leader, Mother Anne, was the female manifestation of Christ, who had founded an entirely separate church. Anyways, Diggers were a politically radical community in the 17th century. They formed small independent farming communes without social classes. Okay. So anyways, I say all that just to show that there is a transition between Protestantism to the Enlightenment. In between Protestantism, which doubted Catholic theology, and the Enlightenment, which doubted Christian theology, you have these Quakers and Shakers who are kind of like half Christian. They're doubting most of Christianity, and you can see that they kind of stand as a placeholder between the Protestant rebellion and then finally the Enlightenment rebellion of the 18th century and 19th century. What is at the heart of that Enlightenment rebellion? The Cartesian cyclone of doubt leads directly to the Enlightenment movements, the so-called Enlightenment movements, where scholars believe that they're becoming enlightened from the darkness of Christian theology. Now, scholars prefer not to refer to one Enlightenment, but to refer to a English Enlightenment, Scottish Enlightenment, a French Enlightenment, and a German Enlightenment. The English and the French Enlightenments were a lot more materialistic. The German Enlightenment was more open to spiritual forces, sort of like Plato was. However, the German Enlightenment would not be exactly religious or Christian. Rather, the German Enlightenment saw the great spiritual force behind the history of the Germanic peoples as being the soul of the nation of the Germans, referred to as the Volk of the nation in German. So that's where we get words like Volkswagen, for example. In general, the French and English Enlightenments would more argue for just materialism in general. They would cast doubt on any sort of spiritual forces which were guiding history other than matter itself. In general, and especially in England and France, the Enlightenment has been described as an attempt to separate scholarship from Christian theology. That's especially articulated by Baron de Holbach, an Enlightenment scholar from France who lived from 1723 to 1789. He described theology as, quote, only the ignorance of natural causes reduced to a system, end quote. So this is the extremely ignorant summation of Christian theology, or just religion in general. And you often hear this from just sophomoric atheists, whether they're actually like sophomores in college or whether they're college professors who haven't matured very much since then. They'll say things like, oh, in the past, the Greek people looked up to the skies and, they didn't know where the thunder came from, so they thought, well, there must be a God up there who throws the thunder down on the earth. And they think that sort of ignorance of what causes thunder to be the source of all religion or all theism as just like a placeholder for natural forces that we can't understand. And of course, we do understand where lightning comes from today, and that doesn't threaten our understanding of God. So the belief in God is much more than just a placeholder for material forces we don't understand anymore. However, atheists just ignore that. They don't want to have an actual, not all atheists perhaps, but many atheists don't want to have an actual conversation with theists and understand what they actually believe about God. It's not that we believe God is merely a part of nature and the cause of much of these natural forces we don't understand, but we believe God is entirely of a different sort of being than all other elements of creation are. He also wrote that theology was composed of only, quote, hazardous suppositions imagined by ignorance, propagated by enthusiasm or knavery, adopted by timid credulity, preserved by custom, which never reasons, and revered solely because not understood, end quote. De Holbach was clearly very ignorant of the centuries of scholastic dialectical or debate. That's what dialectical means, is like debates between scholars. He's very ignorant of the entire scholastic tradition, which of course reasoned very deeply about a great number of topics, much more so than he ever did. Now, if theology is understood as what we understand about the Creator and the manner in which he designed creation, it is ludicrous as a Christian to say that we need to study the natural world without any consideration of theology. Once again, that does not mean that we use theology as a placeholder for natural forces we can't understand. That would be lazy. St. Albert the Great, the teacher of St. Thomas Aquinas, is said to have said that was lazy to try to just attribute natural forces to God when we don't understand them. He was a great proponent for studying the natural world in and of itself. But if we believe we must ignore what we know about divine revelation when studying the natural world, that would be ludicrous because we believe divine revelation is true. And ultimately, all of truth is united, even if we are studying one topic at a time. I have a few Christian scientists here just to kind of clarify that partaking in empirical scientific studies, natural scientific studies, that is not unchristian. Father Mendel is the father of genetic theory, for example. Father Nicholas Steno made key contributions to anatomy and geology, and Father Roger Bacon of the 13th century could be considered the father of the scientific method in general. Now, that means that studying things using the scientific method in which we, set up an experiment or we study things just to study the natural forces, that is not unchristian. And the scientific method, as I just said, was developed by a Franciscan friar. Much of the Enlightenment, on the other hand, was not really empirical. If you read the scholars of the Enlightenment, much of what they say is philosophical musings without any empirical backing. What they're doing is proposing a system in which the universe could have come to be without God. Or they're discussing politics in a manner which does not reference religion or is antagonistic to religion. So the Enlightenment scholars themselves were not exactly empirical. They weren't generally using the scientific method. They were just trying to muse on how to conceive of a world without God. And that was the world they hoped to fashion. How did the Enlightenment influence the principles of Western politics from the 18th and 19th centuries onwards? First, let's look at the French Enlightenment and how that scholarly movement affected political thought. Voltaire is often considered the father of the French Enlightenment. He said, quote, "The authority of the clergy is and can be spiritual only. The clergy should not have any temporal power. No coercive force is proper to its ministry." This is from his Reflections on Religion, and it is, of course, antagonistic to the Christian principle that the church is supreme over the state and has the right to interfere in the state when the state is veering from the ways of God. Montesquieu said, this is not a quote, but this is just me summarizing his thought. Montesquieu said that political liberty was to be found only in moderate governments, and even in these it is not always found. I'm sorry, this is actually a quote. So I'm going to re-say it and just know this is a Montesquieu quote. Okay? Political liberty is to be found only in moderate governments, and even in these it is not always found. It is there only when there is no abuse of power. But constant experience shows us that every man invested with power is apt to abuse it, and to carry his authority as far as it will go. So Montesquieu developed the formulation of the tripartite system of governance to prevent corruption, dividing it into branches such as the United States' judicial, executive, and legislative branches. He believed that it was very important that a government not be capable of abusing its power. So he saw the government as a great threat to the liberty of the people, and he saw the liberty of the people as the highest aim of the state. The state's job is to preserve the liberty of the people. And so we believe the state needs to be designed to protect that liberty. Rousseau believed that the government should always reflect the will of the people and that its primary purpose was to protect the individual's rights. Rousseau is generally considered to be the most radical of these three fathers of the French Revolution. Here is a quote from Rousseau. "The first man who, having enclosed a piece of ground, bethought himself of saying, 'This is mine,' and found people simple enough to believe him, was the real founder of civil society." So what he's describing there is the first person to, quote-unquote, invent private property. He says that the first individual who saw some land and claimed it for himself and convinced others to respect that claim, he's the one who created civil society. And then he wrote about that person, "From how many crimes, wars, and murders, from how many horrors and misfortunes might not anyone have saved mankind by pulling up the stakes or filling up the ditch or crying to his fellows, 'Beware of listening to this impostor. You are undone if you once forget that the fruits of the earth belong to us all, and the earth itself to nobody.'" End quote. So you could see here proto-communist-like thought. There's this disdain for the concept of private property, articulated when he says, "The fruits of the earth belong to us all, and the earth itself belongs to nobody." He's kind of arguing that the whole entire concept of private property is why there is so much social inequality in France in his day. So he's denying that there's an objective nature to private property, and in a sense, he is correct. And even in Catholic thought, we do not believe private property is necessarily an absolute or objective state. We believe as Catholics that private property is a necessary state of things. We must have private property in order to be good stewards of creation. So there is a nuance there. We believe that God wants us to have private property so that we can take the resources of the earth and develop them to their full potential, which we will not do if we are not taking private ownership of those resources. There will not be as much investment into developing those resources. We agree that private property is really a stewardship and that we owe God the fruits that we make of the land. It is not for ourselves only, but we are to use that land and to glorify God and to do his purposes. So that saves us from greed if we keep that in mind about private property. Rousseau is not worried about the glorification of God. He just thinks that the fruits of the earth should be shared equally amongst all the inhabitants of the earth. He also has a sense that he seems to be implying that the resources of the earth are limited and need to be shared equally, and that's just incorrect. The resources of the earth are in fact limited, but sharing them equally prevents them from being developed to their full potential. And right now, the resources of the earth are not being developed to their full potential. Private property gives the incentive necessary to develop the resources of the earth as much as possible and to create more wealth, which can be shared more equally. But if we take the resources and divide those equally, less wealth will be generated and more people will be impoverished. let's look at the English Enlightenment and the thought of the English Enlightenment scholars on politics. John Locke is the most important English scholar when it comes to Enlightenment politics. He developed the principles which led to the marriage of the Enlightenment and democracy in his social contract theory. He said, men, being, as has been said, by nature all free, equal and independent, no one can be put out of this estate and subjected to the political power of another without his own consent. So he's saying naturally we are all free, and so if we are to become, in a sense, unfree by becoming subservient to a state, we cannot do this unless we consent to it. So he's saying the state has no right to rule over anybody who do not want to be ruled over, which is an interesting statement for an Englishman, seeing that the English crown was at this very time oppressing the Irish people, but to my knowledge he was not an opponent of the oppression of the Irish. He wrote that revolt is the right of the people. And so this is, obviously, you could see that his thoughts here are going to be very influential in American politics in the 1770s. Locke's principles are not necessarily incompatible with the Christian state, and as we'll see later, the American state is not incompatible with the Christian state. However, when it came to Voltaire's thoughts about governance, his suggestion that the clergy should have no influence on temporal matters at all is incompatible with the traditional Christian state. What about the German Enlightenment and their influence over politics? Johann Gottfried Herder championed what's called cultural nationalism, which identified a sort of metaphysical national spirit, or Volk, which was comprised of culture and language, which each society needed to protect and pass on to future generations. He believed that one day an international culture would unite all cultures, and that this would be the end of history. This spirit of the culture is called the Volksgeist, and he believed that everyone belonged to the same social class, and so he was in favor of democracy. He himself supported the French Revolution. So you can see here that he believes in not only the spiritual soul of a nation, but he believed that all of the souls of the nations would one day culminate into one global culture. Now, that is a belief in a spiritual force that's kind of separate or independent of Christianity. Immanuel Kant was a German Enlightenment thinker. He crafted what was called transcendental idealism. He believed we cannot empirically verify anything apart from our physical observations, similar to René Descartes. And thus, he believed we cannot know anything about beyond matter. He believed in a moral law which was binding upon all, not because it was given to us by God, but because all should reach the same moral conclusions naturally. He believed that hope in God and an immortal soul was reasonable, but not knowable, making him an agnostic. He is famous for his concept of Reichsstaat. He argued that the state should have limitations imposed in the form of a constitution which prevented from abusing its power. So that would be his contribution to German political thought. George Hegel, finally, who lived at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th centuries, he believed that all segmented parts of history and the universe were moving towards a great totality in which the metaphysical form of the universe would be finally actualized. So he believed the universe was in a state of becoming and it had not accomplished its full form yet. This type of thought would be very influential on the Jesuit condemned writer Teilhard de Chardin, and it's still kind of talked about in liberal segments of theology today. He is often cited as kind of a proto-Marxist because Marxism emerged from this framework to argue that global communism was the totality to which all of human society was moving towards. So once again, we see this sort of sense of a spiritual force guiding the universe, or in Marxism, a sort of quasi-spiritual force guiding global economics towards a sort of totality, which in reality is an independent spiritual force from the Christian theological tradition. So to review the principles of the secular state, all of these principles at the top here are common to all Enlightenment-inspired states. On the bottom, we'll talk about unique principles to the Enlightenment states of each of the three nations we just discussed. But all of these Western nations would come to believe, as a result of the Enlightenment, that the state functions as a form of service to society, not a means to actualize the divine order. They all believed that the state's legitimacy was derived not from the divine order, but from the consent of the people in a social contract. They also believed that due to a lack of material distinctions, there is no objective reality to the concept of social classes, and that all classes and manners of people are in fact equal. In France, the people came to believe that the government's primary purpose was to protect individual rights and promote the will of the people. They believed that human reason should guide the state, not the divine order. In Great Britain, there was a belief that the government's primary purpose was to exist for whatever purpose the people wished it to exist. They also believed that tradition should not be utterly discarded. And in Germany, there came to form a belief that the government's primary purpose was to preserve and defend and even promote the spirit of the national people, the spirit of the German people. And we can clearly see in that final box there how this concept that the state is there to promote the glory of the German spirit, that would be very influential in the First and Second World Wars. Throughout this time, not only were there scholars advocating for these ideas, but there was actually troops on the ground infiltrating different levels of local governments trying to advance these secular ideas. The Freemasons were an order which was formed to build a new world order in which the secular values of the Enlightenment would be actualized in each of the states of the Western world. Catholicism, which still held that the church was superior to the state, was the natural adversary of the Masonic order, and that adversarial relationship remains between the Freemasons and the Catholic Church today. What about communism? Communism doesn't really form during the Enlightenment, but in the middle of the 19th century instead. But Karl Marx is picking up where the Enlightenment political thinkers left off. To Karl Marx, who lived from 1818 to 1883, the ideal state was an atheistic communist state. He's the one that takes the ideas of the Enlightenment and unifies them into a complete system, especially that is of the German Enlightenment. Agreeing with de Holbach, Marx's ideal state was based upon his materialist conception of history. All events in cosmological and human history were caused by material forces. To Marx, the form of each state in human history was actually a reflection of who in each state was in control of the means of production of wealth in that nation. So he believed that the governments of all human societies had been created by the owners of production in order to preserve the economic order. In other words, if a society was an agrarian society, largely based on the farming of wheat, for example, the owners of the most land would end up becoming the rulers of the government, and they would create a social structure to keep that distribution of power in place. That's what Marx believed. Marx also believed that the religions of all human societies served mainly or only to reinforce the economic status quo. This is why Marxists refer to the God of Israel as the great agrarian God. They believe the God of Israel was a fictional God created by the leaders of an agrarian society who wanted to use a religion to keep the peasants pacified and to keep the peasants in an obedient relationship to them. Firmly believing in the objective equality of all peoples, Marx believed it was essential that societies overthrow existing social, political, and economic orders in order to achieve a truly equal state in which the means of production could be collectively owned by all of the people. He believed, therefore, not only in political democracy, but in economic democracy. Marx is often celebrated by communists for spending each waking hour that he could in the library, studying and formulating his theories. Meanwhile, these communists who celebrate how studious Karl Marx was neglect to mention that as he was wasting away in the library, refusing to get a job and work, his wife and children were starving and living in a heatless home while Marx refused to work to support them. Here are some quotes from Karl Marx. "Everything that exists deserves to perish. Everything that exists deserves to perish. Religion is the opium of the people. It is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of our soulless conditions. Religion gives a distorted worldview. It can offer no solutions to earthly misery, but can offer the promise of an afterlife, just as opium can create hallucinations and distort the taker's perspectives." As materialists, Marx did not believe religion could reflect metaphysical realities, and he didn't even believe that religion could reflect the faith in the metaphysical of those who formed those religions. He looked for a materialist explanation for everything. And so when he looked at religion, he ignored everything in it that could be authentic. He ignored the goodness of saints. He ignored the charity of nuns who gave their whole lives in service to the poor. He ignored the heroism of the leaders who spread the gospel and laid down their lives to do so. Because to Marx, everything had to fit in his very narrow conception of politics. And in his mind, everything about a society was a mere reflection of how the owners of production wanted to keep the poor in their place. And so he tried to find a way to take religion and fit it within that very narrow framework. And that's why he describes religion as two things: a system in which the peasants are taught to be obedient to the rulers, and an opium to pacify them. Which is interesting because besides Christianity, not all religions provide any sort of a happy afterlife. So if you believe that, there are gods in the heavens who are just basically living a big party lifestyle and there's no eternal reward for you, you're going to be a phantom in Hades for the rest of eternity. That's not very good opium, but anyways. Now, can communism be subjugated to a divine order? Is it possible to have a communist society within a Christian framework? No. Let's talk about why. Marxism is first and foremost, a historiographical lens. It's a way of viewing human history. And Marx designed this system of historiography to view all of history in a materialist manner, especially an economic manner. The greatest evil in Marxism is material inequality, or economic inequality. Since all people are posited as equal in dignity in Marxist theory, the greatest evil is when they have different amounts of resources. Since the only good for Marx is material, the only evil is when people are not materially equal. He believed that the greatest good in a society is equality in material prosperity. So there is, from its very foundation, an orientation towards worldliness, greed, and envy in a Marxist society. And we as Christians, from our very foundation, conceive of society as being good when it is oriented towards the glory of God and the sanctification of its people. Being oriented totally towards material prosperity and material equality is not a good foundation for society at all. In a Christian state, the greatest good, due to their materialist outlooks, Marxists have always viewed religion as the fictitious creations of oppressive social orders, of course, as we already mentioned. But with that said, if you wanted to imagine of a communist society blended with Christianity, I suppose you might assume the leaders would theoretically just get rid of that part of Marxism, even though, once again, Marxism has always been to its core a materialistic, historiographical, and economic system. Now, the communal sharing of resources for the collective benefit of the community is not necessarily opposed to Christianity. That's, in fact, what religious orders do. Religious orders take vows of poverty where they renounce personal possessions in order to contribute all of their efforts towards the community. However, that is voluntary, and that is a form of devotion to God. To impose such a surrender of one's private property to an entire state is more problematic. This requires the forcible confiscation of resources from people, because not everyone is agreeing to do that, especially to the state. That's just not the nature of a state. And so if you have to forcibly confiscate resources from people, that is theft. No one can be forced to take vows of poverty and enter a religious community, for example. And if they did, they would not be very good members of it, and they would not contribute to at all to the stewardship of the resources of the religious community if they were involuntarily a part of it. That's what a communist state does with great numbers of people who do not want to be a part of that sort of a system. In reality, people have, with the private resources which they possess, they have carefully nourished them to create greater wealth. The generation of wealth ends up benefiting the entire society in which that wealth is generated. When the wealth and the resources are confiscated involuntarily by the state, that discourages those who receive the new resources to take as much pride in them and to steward them and to generate as much wealth from them as would have happened if they had just remained within the hands of the individual who had been nourishing them and nurturing them before the communist state confiscated them. Also, it's important to remember that in reality, the world does not contain a static amount of wealth which must be distributed fairly. Wealth is generated by the ingenuity of independent economic agents as a result of them possessing private property. Now, moderate government programs to assist the poor and laws or trade unions to prevent the abject oppression of the working class can give persons of all social classes the opportunity to take stewardship of their own resources to generate further wealth without confiscating lawful citizens' resources in order to distribute them to others, where they will likely be squandered by those who do not have the aptitude or the willingness to nurture them carefully. Okay, so it would take some time from the publishing of the Communist Manifesto in 1848 until the Communist Revolution for an actual communist state to develop. So we're going to shelf communism for now and come back to it in a later video. As the Enlightenment movement spread throughout the 18th centuries throughout the West, other social institutions besides just the government would continue to adopt more atheistic orientations. So let's talk about the spread of secular ideology throughout popular Western society. With the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment and subsequent schools of thought tried to create objective methods for each of the scholarly disciplines, labeling as superstitious anything that could not be empirically verified. Ultimately, the lack of the ability to empirically verify objective truth, objective beauty, or objective goodness, moral goodness that is, would cause Western civilization to gradually lose its faith in objective truth, beauty, and goodness at all. So how did the loss of the sense of objective truth, beauty, or goodness affect Western civilization? Let's look at social sciences first. The social sciences such as history, philosophy, and sociology began to race to see which assumptions could be discarded due to a lack of absolute proof. And this would be the purpose of philosophers for the next few hundred years in those scholarly strains which descended from the Enlightenment, was to see which assumptions about the world that everyone used to hold could in fact not be empirically verified, to the point where in the postmodern period we have radical doubt in almost everything that people would have assumed to have been true previously, even elements of our own body and the distinction between gender. The arts began to lose their grounding in objective beauty and began to emphasize the articulation of the subjective emotional experiences of the artist. The point of modern art would come to be not to depict great beauty, but to depict emotions, because emotions could be verified as true because we are experiencing them. However, the reality of an objective beauty would begin to fade in the minds of most Westerners. When people say beauty is in the eye of the beholder, I wouldn't recommend having a philosophical debate with the person just because they said that, but beauty is not just in the eye of the beholder. Beauty is God and anything that resembles God, and something is more beautiful the more closely that it resembles God. Modern art would no longer attempt to depict beauty, a concept that artists would lose faith in. Instead, it would try to depict the emotional state of man. Art became more and more emotional, and gradually more and more nonsensical. Eventually, art would become, frankly, not beautiful, but people would still be able to appreciate it who were, children of the Enlightenment, because they believe not in beauty, but in emotions. Ethics would begin to develop towards situation ethics. Philosophers would cease to have belief in intrinsic evils, things that were always wrong because of because they stood in contradiction to the eternal law of God. There began to be a loss of faith in the objective moral law, and instead of that, philosophers turned to situational ethics, which basically states that an action is good or bad depending upon the situation and depending upon the end in which it achieved or intended to achieve. The hard sciences began to depend entirely on the scientific method, often overstretching the limitations of these experiments to propose metaphysical theories that contradicted divine revelation. So let's talk a little bit more about the physical sciences and their influence over Western civilization after the Enlightenment. Let's start with psychology. To review, before the Enlightenment, mental health was simply understood as spiritual health. The soul was considered healthy when it was in communion with God, and when it was living a life of the theological and cardinal virtues. It was believed that it was vice that created unhappiness in the soul rather than quote-unquote mental illness. Once again, while this framework may not have been perfect, it did have a lot more success than, well, it could be argued that this framework for understanding mental health as spiritual health had a lot more success in actually guiding people towards healthy interior lives than modern psychology does. As modern psychology has grown to more and more influence over Western civilization, mental health has gotten worse and worse. And that should be telling about the strength of the foundations that stand underneath secular psychology. Secular psychology, as we know it today, began to develop in the 19th century as a means to understand the human psyche. Psyche is Greek for soul. But psychology seeks to understand the human soul in a manner which was divorced from traditional Christian anthropology, the belief that humans are spiritual. The earliest and most influential psychologists include Sigmund Freud, an Austrian, who lived from 1856 to 1939. He was an atheist. He taught that the human psyche was the result of a tension between primal desires, especially lust, which he called the id, social restraint, which he called the superego, and he believed that the personality of the individual was the result of this tension. The resulting personality he called the ego. Let's talk about Albert Bandura, a Canadian who lived from 1925 all the way until 2021. He was an agnostic. He leaned towards atheism. He taught that learning takes place through observation and the modeling of behaviors rather than through an innate human nature. He taught the way we believed was a result of our learning. He believed that our learning was through modeling. He did not believe in an objective human nature. William James, an American who lived from 1842 to 1910. He was an atheistic leaning agnostic. He believed there was an innate connection between emotions and the mental state. He believed there was an innate connection between emotions and the body, the physical body. Ivan Pavlov, Russian from 1849 to 1936. He was an atheist. He believed that behaviors were the result of conditioning. He believed that rewards and punishments for said behaviors shaped the way we behaved, and he was opposed to free will. Carl Rogers was an American. He lived from 1902 to 1987. He was an atheist. He believed that psychological well-being was based upon the satisfaction of primal needs, including safety, belongingness, self-esteem, and freedom. Erik Erikson was an American who lived from 1902 to 1994. He was an agnostic Jew. He believed in the gradual formation of the personality in response to habits formed by children while attempting to achieve trust, autonomy, intimacy, individuality, integrity, and identity. And so he is against the concept that the soul was formed by God independently. He believed that the personality was formed through these different stages of childhood. Lev Vygotsky was a Russian who was an agnostic Jew. He lived from 1896 to 1934. He taught that learning happened through social interactions rather than through isolated exposure to information. So I share all of that with you because these are really the founding fathers of psychology. Each of them are atheists, and their theories oftentimes are being formed in opposition to traditional Christian ideas about the human person. That's the foundation upon which psychology was built upon. And so while I'm not saying that anyone should, steer clear of receiving counseling or therapy if they feel they need it, and I do think that counseling and therapy can be very helpful if it's done under the light of divine revelation, we should be aware that psychology at its very foundation was formed upon atheistic premises, and we should understand that even a Christian counselor was likely trained using these atheistic premises, and you might question whether or not even Christian counselors or Catholic counselors have really deeply thought about whether or not the premises that they base their practice upon were really formed in an atheistic tradition, which was opposed to traditional Christian anthropology. Once again, that is not me encouraging anyone to avoid counseling if they feel that it could be helpful for us. Now, we could get ahead of ourselves. We could talk about 20th century psychology and how it developed to promote horrific practices like the forcible
basically imprisonment of mentally ill people in insane asylums, many of which now are abandoned and considered haunted and a favorite spot for teenagers to break into and explore. Those hauntings could be signs of the great spiritual darkness that happened in those places. We could get ahead of ourselves and talk about Dr. John Money and his horrendous experiment in which he encouraged parents to do some horrendous things to their son, who was born with ambiguous anatomy, we'll say. I know I have some kids watching the show, so I need to be very vague. But if you would like to explore that story, that would be very damning on the trajectory that modern psychology would take throughout the 20th century. Dr. John Money performed horrendous experiments on Brian and his brother, who would go by the name of David, even though he was raised as Brenda, horrifically, because of John Money's encouragement to David's mother and father. After these horrendous experiments on David, in which he was raised as a girl, once again, because of the horrific thought of Dr. John Money, Brian, who was involved in these experiments in very inappropriate ways, would overdose at the age of 36. David would commit suicide at the age of 38. Horrific, very sad. However, Dr. John Money is celebrated today as the founder of modern gender theory. Okay, back to the 19th century, let's talk about Darwin now. So Darwin is, of course, the great father of evolution, or is he? He lived from 1809 to 1882. Darwin was not the founder of evolution itself. His own grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, actually published a book titled Zoomania, in which he articulated a gradual creation of modern animals through processes of evolution. The Greek philosophers Anaximander, Empedocles, and Lucretius actually all also had theories resembling that of evolution. So evolution is a concept which exists before Darwin, and in fact, in Darwin's famous text, The Origin of Species, he never even used the term evolution to describe the process that he was writing about. Darwin's father sent him to medical school. However, he was uninspired. He preferred to study naturalism. He took part in a naturalist club, which enjoyed debating traditional religious concepts about the creation of the universe, antagonizing traditional Christian beliefs. He ended up dropping out of medical school, and he was actually sent to a seminary by his father, but he would leave there as well to pursue a career in naturalism. In his landmark text, The Origin of Species, Darwin articulated not the concept of evolution itself, but the process of natural selection. He believed that species which were most adapted to their environments due to random variations, because if you think about it, a mother bird has 6 baby birds, they're all going to have variations. The one that is the most suited to survive in their environment will be most capable of reproducing, and the variations which will be passed on will eventually get passed on more and more, and that causes species to develop in a certain trajectory according to what he called natural selection. In a sense, he was describing the process of agricultural breeding taking place on a natural level by nature itself. So Darwin's fame consists not in the idea that he taught that there was evolution, but that he gave evolution a framework in which it could certainly exist. But we could argue that Darwin is actually most famous because he provided a framework which modern Enlightenment-inspired peoples could contrast to the biblical narrative of Genesis chapter 1 and 2. He named his text The Origin of Species, and he may have done this to try to contrast what he believed was the origin of species with the biblical origin of species you see in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. He also argued that all living species descended from a primordial single species through the process of natural selection. He did not believe, he implied a lack of belief in divine providence in guiding this process of natural selection. He believed it was random variation that caused the development of species and this force of natural selection. It was not the guiding hand of God. Darwin provided a framework to contest the literal interpretation of the very first words of Scripture. And a Western civilization that had become eager to believe in a world and a cosmos and a great ecosystem which was independent of the creator God, enjoyed the opportunity that Darwin gave them to kind of rebel intellectually from a world which was directly fashioned by God. Today, Biology courses heavily focus on the theory of evolution. They spend a great amount of time talking about natural selection and Darwin and the origin of species, even though this is really not that important towards modern biological studies. If someone is to end up getting a degree in biology, they're not going to spend their time researching the origin of species. They're going to spend their time researching actual cells and coming up with new cures to diseases. They're going to work as doctors in hospitals. So evolution is really not that important to the discipline of biology. The overemphasis on evolution is probably due to this history that Darwin's theory of natural selection became so popular because it allowed Enlightenment-inspired peoples to kind of rebel from the biblical tradition. That's why it gets more importance than is necessary. However, it's important to know that actually Darwin's theory of natural selection was an interesting collection of musings, but it was actually devoid of a scientific mechanism which could explain how it was that species could diversify. Why was it that those 6 baby birds that were born didn't all look identical to one another? Why was it that there was diversification amongst the offspring? It was actually Father Gregor Mendel's study of genetics which gave Darwinian evolution the scientific framework it needed in order to actually become useful to scientists who were studying biology and evolution in a practical manner. Later biologists would come to posit that random mutations later biologists would come to posit that it was random mutations which accounted for the diversification of the genetic makeup of particular species. However, current biologists believe it is not only random mutations, but other forces can account for genetic variations from parents to offspring. Now, Darwin's theory of natural selection has a tremendous influence over social sciences as well. Harvard's own Louis Agassiz, who lived from 1807 to 1873, believed in polygenism. He believed that humanity was actually composed of distinct species. His studies were supported by what he called craniology, which was an authentic scientific discipline in the 19th century, which deemed that the skulls of white people proved that they had intellectual superiority to the skulls of blacks. Later psychological studies pointed towards increased rates of aggressions in blacks and higher intelligence in whites on standardized tests. And so it was modern psychology which continued to reinforce the idea that white people were superior intellectually to black people. Now, these studies were, of course, not accounting for the differences in social economic status, which would cause higher rates of crime among certain groups who struggled with lower status, or lack of proper education, which would, of course, lead to lower results in standardized tests. But the point I'm trying to make here is that psychology at the time pointed towards white supremacy. That is, secular atheistic psychology at the time pointed towards that. Harvard's Louis Agassiz used modern science in the 19th century to point towards white supremacy as well. Francis Galton took these scientific findings, secular scientific findings of the 19th century, to argue that society should pass laws to prevent the reproduction of people who were less fit to pass on the most ideal genes than others. And this is the birth of the eugenics movement. The eugenics movement is a movement which is arguing that laws should be passed to engineer society using the breeding practices that farmers use on farms. And I want us to really appreciate that eugenics was born out of the secular, atheistic science of the 19th century. The eugenics movement was not just a small movement relegated to radicals in society. In 1907, the state of Indiana passed compulsory sterilization laws, which would sterilize those undeemed fit for reproduction, including, quote, imbecile women or, quote, idiot inmates in prisons. I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves again, but quickly we'll talk about how the eugenics movement would develop in the United States so that we can understand how this secular, atheistic, scientific movement would wreak havoc, or could have wreaked havoc, in the United States so that we can better appreciate how this secular atheistic movement would wreak havoc in Europe around the same time. On the right, you see an image of Margaret Sanger. Margaret Sanger was a leader of the American Eugenics movement. She lived from 1879 to 1966. She was the founder of Planned Parenthood. She intentionally placed Planned Parenthood abortion clinics in heavily black areas as an effort to cleanse the United States of what she deemed to be an inferior race. Once again, making that conclusion based on the secular atheistic science that she had grown up with. Eugenicist movements in the United States disseminated surveys throughout Western nations and the United States, trying to create pedigree maps. They were attempting to determine which families in each nation possessed unlikable traits such as feeble-mindedness, criminality, or alcoholism. Eventually, these pedigree maps were to be used, it was planned, to determine which families should be forcibly sterilized in order to breed society to be greater and greater. At the top of her November 1921 Birth Control magazine, Sanger used the headline "Birth Control" to create a race of thoroughbreds. This is showing that she and all eugenicists were perceiving human society in the same manner in which they would perceive animals on a farm. Because according to materialistic atheistic thought, that's all we are, is animals. And society has the right to breed the animals inside of it in the same manner that a farmer would breed the animals on his farm. In general, eugenists who were responsive to prevailing secular scientific thought at the time period deemed the white race to be the most superior genetic race of men. The biggest evidence they had for this was the success of the Northern European nations in the 20th century, especially economically. But of course, economic success is a result of many complicated factors, which we won't get into here. Of course, racial superiority is not one of them. Now, once again, making all this point to show the damage that atheistic thought has, the Christian anthropological system very simply understands all humans as descendants of Adam and Eve, one common human family who are all called by God into the waters of baptism to become brothers and sisters in Christ and sons and daughters of the Heavenly Father. Secular atheism does not perceive us as equal at all in that sense. Of course, social Darwinism, eugenics, and Hitler would be the prevailing thought that Hitler would use, once again, scientific for all he knows, to wreak the travesties that he would wreak in the Second World War, but we're not going to get too ahead of ourselves. But modern scientists, when they talk about eugenics, or when they talk about social Darwinism, or when they talk about craniology, will say that all of these were pseudosciences. They're trying to dissociate themselves from these scientific movements which are no longer popular. But they were the prevailing scientific thoughts of the time. Yuval Noah Harari, the writer of Homo Sapiens, an atheistic book, would agree that Hitler was using the modern scientific findings at the time when he was forming his evil ideology. We can call them pseudosciences today because we don't like them, but at the time, that was what science was saying, and this shows us that secular atheistic science, because it is so divorced from divine revelation, is a institution built upon sand, which can cause great suffering and great bloodshed on the world's historical stage. Lastly, let's look at how the Enlightenment influences art. The Enlightenment is what causes the birth of modern art, which we already talked about a bit earlier, so I'll just review it a little bit here. The Enlightenment had cast darkness upon the Western man, rather than casting light upon it, as its name signifies. The idea of objective beauty was entirely foreign to a world that trusted only in what could be empirically verified. Of course, beauty cannot be empirically verified. And so art turns from the attempt to recreate objective beauty to articulating the extreme emotional experience of the artist, or to generate an emotional experience in the viewer. The Rites of Spring was a play from 1913. It was a ballet from 1913, which was attempting to depict the ritualistic human sacrifice of virgins in pagan Roman society, the Rites of Spring. Obviously, just hearing that sentence generates an emotional reaction in you hearing it. So imagine viewing a play that was depicting that sort of a thing at the very turn of the 20th century. The creator of the ballet Rites of Spring was not attempting to depict beauty. He was attempting to create a powerful experience. And that would be the purpose of all of art in general. That's why modern art is so weird to people that believe in objective beauty, because they see it and they say, that is not beautiful, that is weird. But to someone who buys into that system of art, they see it and they say, wow, that makes me feel blank. And that's all they're really looking at art to do, since they don't believe in beauty at all. We'll talk more about how Hitler was inspired by modern art in a later video. In his book, Rites of Spring by Maudries Eksteins, he makes the argument that Hitler's rhetoric and leadership style reflected the interior disposition of a modern artist who was not so much focused on objective truth or objective goodness or beauty, but was trying to generate a powerful experience. Let's go back to the 19th century. I wanted to finish this video by discussing the Catholic response to the Enlightenment. However, we're kind of way over time here. So at the very beginning of the next video, we're going to look at how the Catholic Church is responding to all the different movements that we've discussed so far in this video. We're going to see that the Church has always been opponents to the Enlightenment movement. And we're going to look at how the writings of St. Pius X at the end of the 19th century, in which St. Pius X would condemn what he called modernism and wrote the Oath Against Modernism, his work was not coming out of nowhere. Pope Pius X was continuing the anti-Enlightenment program of the popes and the church in general throughout the 19th century, and that is a very interesting story worth telling, which we will discuss to begin our next video, as well as we'll talk about the secular states and how they would coalesce to collapse in the First World War as a result of their atheistic beliefs. Let's pray in the name in nomine Patris et Filii et Spirituis Sancti. Ave Maria, gratia plena Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus. Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spirituis Sancti. Well, God bless you, and may the Holy Spirit of truth remove from your minds anything I have said that is untrue or unpleasing to Him. Hope you have a great day. Keep me in your prayers and pray for the United States of America. All right, goodbye.